How are you guys doing?
What was that?
How are you guys doing?
I'm just ready for the week to be over.
Are you? Yeah, isn't everybody? Yeah, you guys haven't ever experienced a fall break, but I didn't think it was going to be that big of a deal going without one. But now that I haven't had one, I kind of want my fall break back. All right, it is 12:30, so we'll get started. First of all, congratulations. You have made it this far into evolution and ecology. We are about to begin the last case study. It is a case study that is going to revisit topics that we covered at the beginning of the semester about evolutionary biology, and it will add to those. So it will build on that background, that foundation that you have in evolution. A couple of things. I thought that back when I had loaded all of the literature that you were going to be reading onto the Moodle site, that I had loaded the reading for today on the Moodle site, but evidently I didn't do that. So I was hoping that you had read a book chapter by this guy named Edmund Brody III, in preparation for class today. But when I looked on the Moodle site, I realized that I had not posted that yet. So anyway, it's posted now. Read it at your earliest convenience. It's a book chapter from a book called In the Light of Evolution. This is a book that highlights a variety of different kinds of evolutionary biology research, but it is written to be approachable to the broader public. And one of the chapters actually reviews everything that we're going to talk about in this last case study. So it's a good introduction for you to kind of lay the foundation for the things that are going to come ahead in the next 3.5 weeks. So that is now on the Moodle site. So please read that between now and Friday, because you couldn't read it before today because I'm an idiot. So anyway, the other thing that I want to tell you about is I have sent out the Veen et al. Summaries to you. So you should have gotten an email that has somebody else's literature summary in it, not yours. And your task is to take that and make comments on it the same way that Dr. Judd or I would make comments on your literature summaries. And half of your grade for the Veen et al. Summary is going to be on the quality of your evaluation of someone else's summary, and the other half of your grade is going to be on the quality of your own summary as evaluated by us. So do that and have it back to us by November 30th. There are instructions in the November 30th week on how to go through that, and there is a submission link there for you to submit your reviewed literature summaries of your peers. Like I said before, one of the advantages of looking at other people's writing is you get ideas about your own writing. But then another thing is that it also trains you when you look at someone else's writing critically. it begins to train you how you can look at your own writing critically. So all of that is a good thing ultimately. So Dr. Judd, do you have anything to add?
Just a reminder about using chapter 6 in your book and using the rubric that we use. But there's some information about that kind of stuff, those kinds of techniques in the instructions, I'm sure.
Yeah, so in the assignment, there's actually a copy of the rubric. There's a copy of the rubric up at the very top of the middle page, but in case you don't know that it's there, I've also included a copy of the rubric in the assignment, so you can just download that there as well. As always, save those as PDFs and then submit them to the link that is there for submitting the assignment. Anything else? Dr. Judd, you're having lab virtually tomorrow, is that correct?
Yes, I sent an email out to you all yesterday. Hopefully you got that, and we'll be doing virtual lab tomorrow morning.
Okay, I'm still working through the Tuesday lab groups data, so look for that email when it appears. All right, so I'm going to share my screen with you, and depending on how far we get through this, we may come to some slides where there are questions that you actually have no possible way of answering those questions, because once again, I did not post the reading, but we'll get through it regardless. So this last case study is a case study centered on a predator-prey interaction. And it's a predator-prey interaction between a species of newt, which is a type of amphibian. Think eye of a newt that a witch would use to poison someone. And so many amphibians have chemical defenses that they create to avoid predation. And in this case, there is a snake that eats this newt that, at least in some populations, has evolved resistance to the toxin that is produced by the newt. So it becomes an interesting case study from the standpoint of how predators and prey interact with one another, and how different forms of selection pressure act to shape the anti-predator mechanisms that prey have, and the predator subduing, or the prey subduing mechanisms that predators have. So, so we're going to start just talking about some general predator-prey ideas. And so the first thing that we want you to understand is we want you to understand the predation sequence. Some of you probably got introduced to this at the very beginning of the semester in lab, when we were talking about the different things that organisms have to do in order to survive from day to day and survive to reproduce ultimately. One of those was avoiding predation, and at least in my lab, when we talked about avoiding predation or finding food, I kind of walked you quickly through this thing called the predation sequence, and we're going to explore that in more detail today. And then the other purpose of today is to have you gain some insight into the process of science by reviewing Brody III, 2011, which once again is this book chapter that I will expect that you have read by the beginning of class on Friday. This is a paragraph from a paper that I read back when I was in graduate school, and just take a minute and read it. Okay, what's the main point of this particular quote?
Being killed greatly decreases future fitness.
Okay, so that's what I put in bold and italics. So certainly being killed greatly reduces future fitness. In terms of selection, though, which species is experiencing the heaviest degree of selection? Is it the predator that is experiencing the heaviest degree of selection, or is it the prey?
Right?
Who was that? Connor. Yeah. Why do you think it's prey?
Because if you're the predator, then you don't, I mean, I guess you don't really have to worry about, a predator getting you. I don't know.
Well, so some predators have to worry about predators getting them, but in that case, they're not predators, they're prey. But when you're the predator, you're preying on somebody else. If you don't get the prey that you're going for, what happens to you?
You go hungry.
You go hungry. And if you continue to suck really bad at capturing prey, you'll eventually do what?
Starve and die.
You'll eventually starve to die, but at any given moment, your failure at acquiring prey doesn't lead to immediate death. On the other hand, somebody else tell me what happens if you are the prey and you lose a given predator-prey interaction?
You die.
You die, and that's it. That's it. You're over. Your genes have now been swallowed by some predator, and there's no way that you are ever going to reproduce again. And so this is the basis of what's come to be known as the life dinner principle, which was proposed by, if I'm recalling correctly, Krebs and Dawkins back in the 1970s. And it deals with this idea of the consequences for the two players in any predator-prey interaction. If the predator loses the predator-prey interaction, it merely goes hungry. It simply loses its dinner. However, if the prey loses, it loses its life. And so this has become what's known as the life dinner principle, because it kind of boils down this asymmetry in a predator-prey interaction, such that if a predator loses the predator-prey interaction, it merely loses its dinner, whereas if the prey loses the interaction, the prey loses its life. And so we generally assume that there's more selection acting on prey than act on predators. And this is just a pithy little quote that gets that idea across cleanly and concisely. Questions about that? Does that seem just logically apparent to you? Okay, good. So we have used this term adaptation a couple of times now over the course of the semester, and maybe your ideas have changed some on what this term means, but I just want to revisit for a few minutes what you guys mean when you hear the word adaptation or when you use the word adaptation.
Like a change.
Okay, go into more detail with that, Tavares.
Like an organism changing to better fit the environment.
Okay, so in this case, you're referring to adaptation as a process.
Yes, sir.
And you said by which organisms better fit the environment. Tavares, what do you mean by better fit the environment?
Like if there's something that's killing a certain organism off, they might, or like, dang, I'm trying to put in the words, like,
Take your time.
I don't know, give them a leg up.
Okay, so
All right.
so we have this idea that we have talked about before called fitness. Somebody tell me what fitness is, as we have been defining it in this class. This is not a new term to you, is it?
Wasn't it the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce?
Okay, so the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce, those things, surviving and reproducing, contribute to fitness. And so this is certainly directly in line with how we think about fitness. But fitness itself, how would we measure? What are the units that we would measure fitness in? Think back to the horned lizard paper where they had that fitness surface, that selection surface. On the y-axis was fitness, and it went from 0 to 1. Why did that fitness surface or that selection surface or that adaptive landscape, if you want to call it that, why did it vary from 0 and go all the way up to 1? And it didn't go any higher than 1. It was just 0 to 1.
Was it like how effectively they passed their genes?
Sort of. Because in order to pass your genes from one generation to the next, you have to first do what?
Reproduce.
Well, but before you have to reproduce, you have to do what?
Survive.
You have to survive. And so if you're surviving in this graph, what are you at? Are you at 0 or are you at 1?
1.
Yeah, you're at 1. And for the horned lizards, there were a bunch of individuals up here at 1, if you had long horn length, and there were other individuals down here with shorter horn lengths. And what is the state of those?
Means that if you have longer horns, then you survive better than shorter.
And if you have
horns.
shorter horns,
You like the chance you die is higher.
yeah, you're dead. So your choice here, it's a binary choice where survival is concerned. You're either alive or you're dead. You can't be somewhere in between in terms of thinking about fitness. And this led to this sort of directional selection surface or adaptive landscape where there's directional selection acting on these guys. So one way of thinking about fitness is to think of it as a 0-1 proposition. You're either alive or you're dead. And that's the kind of way of thinking about it when we think about predator-prey interactions. And the horned lizard example was definitely a predator-prey interaction. They had a population of horned lizards that were alive. They had a bunch of horned lizards that had been impaled by shrikes that were the dead population. And when they looked at the phenotype, they saw that more of the live ones had long horns and way more of the dead ones had short horns. And this is how we measure selection. But what's another way that we can quantify fitness? Not just the 0-1 way, which is how we quantify survival.
How many you reproduce, maybe?
Yeah, so another way of doing this is to quantify how many offspring an individual has reproduced. Dr. Judd, how many children do you have, if you want to share?
I'm at 0.
Oh my gosh, Dr. Judd has a fitness of 0. Dr. Judd, how many children do I have?
Also 0?
Also 0. There are other people in our department that have 2 offspring. One has 3 offspring. One has 1 offspring. Evolutionarily, where are Dr. Judd and I in terms of our fitness?
0.
We're at 0, aren't we? We've survived to sexual reproduction, but we haven't reproduced yet. And as a result, all that survival doesn't really matter at all, because unless we reproduce, we're not passing our genes off into the next generation. And so when we talk about fitness, we oftentimes think of survival as a component of fitness. But when we think about the end game, ultimately what matters is your lifetime reproductive success. And so I've talked about this, this definition before. Lifetime reproductive success is really the purest form of fitness. Now, you can't reproduce if you don't survive to reproductive age, so survival is a component of that. And there may be all sorts of physiological characteristics and morphological characteristics that help you survive and help you reproduce. And those are all what we would refer to as correlates of fitness. My students in my lab, in my research lab right now, study sprint speed of lizards. And so sprint speed could get you out of a jam if you're being attacked by a predator. And so that is a correlate of fitness, but it's not fitness itself. It may lead you to survive, to be able to reproduce, but in and of itself, it doesn't do the reproducing for you. So try and whenever you talk about fitness, think about lifetime reproductive success. Who's the most fit family in the United States right now? Dr. Jett's smiling because he's tired of this example. You guys should know this. You're cognizant of popular culture, probably way more so than I am. Kat, are you about to say something?
Are you talking about the Duggars?
Oh my God, I'm talking about the Duggars. How are the Duggars doing in terms of fitness?
Don't they have like 12 kids?
It's like 19.
Last time I heard, they were 19 and counting. Which basically means those of us in biology, we really need to up our game if we're going to keep the Duggars from totally like swamping the gene pool with people like the Duggars. So one of the things that happens when you calculate fitness is the fitness that you have is always relative to whoever has the highest fitness in your population. And so one way of doing this would be to divide all of these numbers by 19, and that would give us what we call relative fitness. What is any individual's fitness relative to the most fit individual in the population? And keep in mind, when we talk about the most fit individual, we just really mean the individual that is producing the most offspring in a population. In that case, Dr. Judd and I would still be at the very bottom of the heap here, but our colleagues in the biology department wouldn't be that much further above us compared to the high level of productivity of one particular family in the United States. And there may be other families in the United States that have higher reproductive capacity. It's just that we don't know about them because they don't have a reality TV show. Although I would think that they probably would have gone after one after the Duggars appeared. So that takes us back to Tavares's definition. So I don't really like us using the term fit in there because it brings me back to fitness. And fitness is definitely involved in defining what an adaptation is and the process of adaptation, but can we refine this definition in a way that makes it maybe a little more productive? And Tavares can work on this, or anybody else can work on this.
Maybe better survive in their environment.
Okay, sure. Process by which organisms and we could also add reproduction in there. So this defines adaptation as a process, and that's fine. It's an evolutionary process. But what are other ways in which we use the term adaptation? So Tavera started us off by defining it as a process, which it is.
It's also an effect that comes
Yeah.
out of something.
Well, it's actually the end result that comes out of what? So yeah, it's the end result of this process of evolution, selecting in ways that individuals survive or don't, or reproduce or don't. And so this comes from this evolutionary process of adaptation, or the evolutionary process of selection, actually. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. What's another way in which we use adaptation? The term adaptation. Now you're thinking, oh my God, how many ways do we use the term adaptation? Plenty, too many, in my opinion. Any of you guys ever go out to the Rocky Mountains? What happens when you first get up around 11, 12,000 feet in the Rockies, or maybe go up to 14,000 feet in the Rockies?
Your ears start to like pressurize.
So your ears pop, sure, but what else happens?
Guessing it's going to get a little harder to breathe.
It's going to get harder to breathe. I ride a bike ride sometimes out there called the Triple Bypass. It goes over a mountain pass. It goes over 3 mountain passes, but the highest mountain pass is 12,000 feet in elevation. When I ride in that ride, I generally go out there the week before to ride around in the mountains. Why do I go out there a week before to ride around in the mountains on my bicycle?
So you get used to the atmosphere.
Yeah, and so this is a type of adaptation that is referred to as physiological adaptation. The problem with it is oftentimes people don't put the physiological in front of it. So what happens when you find yourself in a low oxygen environment is that your body will respond, and it will respond by creating more red blood cells. And over a period of time, that increase in red blood cells actually helps you just breathe easier and exercise with less effort in a high altitude environment. But as soon as you go back down to sea level, or down to 500 feet elevation or 800 feet elevation, or whatever it is that we're at here in Missouri, your body will stop producing those blood cells. Those blood cells will live out their lives and ultimately become degraded and destroyed. And you will go back to your flatlander level of hematocrit that you had before you went into the mountains, where your hematocrit went up temporarily. Because people sometimes confuse that short-term change, short-term physiological change, with evolutionary adaptations, I tend to not use the term adaptation. I tend to use the term acclimation. When you go to the mountains in Colorado, you acclimate to high altitude by producing more red blood cells, raising your hematocrit, which gives you greater oxygen carrying capacity, which allows you to cope with the changing environment that you've put yourself into. You guys have probably been going through the process of acclimation to colder temperatures here in the fall going into winter. When we first got those cold snaps about a month ago, you had been walking around in shorts and t-shirts, and all of a sudden everybody's walking around with sweaters and hoodies, and it's only 55 degrees out. Come February and March, what's going to happen when it gets up to 55 degrees when it's been cold all winter? And I know this will happen because I see it happen every spring.
Walking around in shorts.
Oh yeah, it's like, woo, 55, get out the shorts and t-shirts. So what happens is you've gone through this period of acclimation to warm weather during the summer. And when we get those first cold snaps, you're like, oh my God, it's cold. but it really isn't that cold. It's only 55 degrees. And then we go into winter and our bodies acclimate to cold weather. And then when it starts to warm up in the spring, even though it's only 55, it feels so much warmer to us because we've gone through this acclimation process. So acclimation to temperature is also super common. That's another thing that students in my lab study is the acclimation of cold-blooded organisms to temperature changes and how it affects their physiology and their ability to sprint. So use acclimation for physiological adaptation simply because it reduces confusion. Questions about any of that? All right, there's a paper written back in 1982 that delved into this even more deeply. And their argument, one of the arguments that they were trying to make in this paper is that adaptation is a term that should only be used for a trait, a characteristic, whether that's a physiological trait, a morphological trait, or a behavioral trait. And keep in mind that traits can be any of those things. They can be physiological, they can be morphological, and they can be behavioral. Dr. Judd, am I missing a category? Can't hear you for some reason. Still can't hear you.
All right, how about now?
Yeah.
I suppose you might add chemical traits. Most of those will be physiological, but there might be some that.
Yeah, I would probably throw this into physiological because chemicals are going to be generated by some form of physiology, but sure. All right, so these are all traits, but the way that Gould and Verba would define an adaptation is a trait that not only evolves as a result of natural selection acting on that trait, but it evolves for the purpose it is currently used for. So current utility enters into their definition of an adaptation. Because oftentimes things get co-opted. Evolution is very good at using the spare parts that are laying around and putting them to good use. A classic example of this is the thumb. We have an opposable thumb. Most vertebrates do not have opposable thumbs. A limited number of vertebrates do have an opposable thumb. And here we are in the 21st century. And if you were an evolutionary biologist from another planet, you might have come down to Earth and you see this adaptation, which is the opposable thumb, and think to yourself, oh my gosh, this is an adaptation that evolved because people are constantly texting on these little things that they hold in their hands. Is the opposable thumb an adaptation to texting?
No,
Some of you are shaking your head no. Why?
because we had it before we had this kind of technology.
We had thumbs long before we had cell phones to text on. And so can having an opposable thumb for texting improve your fitness? Dominic, you're shaking your head no. Why do you say that? I would argue that it can improve your fitness.
What does a cell phone have to do with reproduction?
Your girlfriend texts you and then you don't text her back for 3 weeks.
Good point.
Oh yeah, it's a good point. Hey baby, what you doing tonight? Text. That could actually influence your fitness. But the opposable thumb isn't an adaptation for texting. It's an adaptation. It's a trait that we have co-opted for all kinds of things. What else do we use our thumb for? Really? You don't use your thumbs for anything but texting?
I mean, to hold other stuff.
It's a grasping thing. And inevitably, this was probably the main driver of selection that led to the evolution of the opposable thumb. It allows you to grab things more firmly than if you don't have that opposable thumb to wrap around something that you're grabbing. In our earliest ancestors, perhaps that was grabbing a branch in a tree or something like that. Later on, it was maybe grabbing a weapon so that you could club your opponent on the head if you were competing for resources, et cetera, et cetera.
When he says our earliest ancestor, you think he means in reference to the thumb. So what did the earliest ancestor that had an opposable thumb look like? That was probably a rather small primate, maybe the closest modern analog would be something like a lemur. So we're not talking about Neanderthals. We're talking about much deeper.
Much deeper in time than that. Yeah. So the opposable thumb is something that's common. It's common for all primates, isn't it, Nathan?
Yep.
Yeah. So that would be a synapomorphy that unites all primates. And Dr. Judd will teach you what a synapomorphy is next semester, hopefully.
Yep.
Yeah. So what else do we use thumbs for?
Maybe communicate a little bit.
Okay, we communicate. We give people a thumbs up. What else do we use? Another
grasping tools.
What's that?
Grasping tools and stuff.
Grasping tools, the club that I just referred to, pounding other people over the head with. Yep. A club is a tool. A weapon is a tool. A weapon is just a subset of tools. Not all tools are weapons, but all weapons could be thought of as tools. I digress. What else do you use your thumb for? People don't do this as much anymore. No?
Talking about like hitchhiking?
Riding.
Oh my God, you got to hitch a ride. You don't hitch a ride with your finger, you hitch a ride with your thumb. Now, unfortunately, hitching a ride with your thumb, and the reason that you guys are unfamiliar with this is that you probably weren't against hitching rides, because hitching a ride could actually probably decrease your fitness if you hitch a ride with an axe murderer, speaking of grasping tools. All right, so Golden Verba would view an adaptation as a trait that you possess, that an organism possesses, that was shaped by natural selection and currently carries out the function that it originally evolved for. And that's a pretty narrow definition, but that's a definition that I walk around with because it allows us to separate adaptations that evolve for their current utility versus adaptations that evolved for some other purpose and then got co-opted for some different purpose later on in evolutionary time. And so it helps us think about what the evolutionary history of traits is, not just what they're currently being used for. So now that we have had a conversation about adaptations, we can think about predator adaptations and prey counter adaptations when we think about the predation sequence. And so you think to yourself, man, that was a really long walk just to be able to talk about the predation sequence. But when we use this term adaptation, I want us to be clear about what we mean. So imagine that you're a predator. Let's say that you're a lion out on the plains of Africa, and you are hungry, and so you need to go and acquire prey. What's the first thing that you have to do?
Find prey.
Okay, so in order to find prey, you have to
smell, look.
Yeah, you have to search for them. So the first phase of the predation sequence is the search phase. And when we think about predators searching for prey, what are the kinds of characteristics or traits that predators might have that help them more effectively find prey?
Like in heightened senses, like smell or hearing or sight.
What else can help them find prey?
Does like stealth count?
That would come later. That would come after you're found something and you're sneaking up on it.
Oh, okay.
What do you ask?
What's that, Connor?
Sorry, I was gonna say hearing, but it's already on there.
Oh yeah, it's already up there. Imagine me sitting at home. Yeah, go ahead, Audrey.
They could follow the footprints or the scat of prey.
Okay, so being mobile, being active is really good. You know, if you're sitting at home in your armchair and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know where the remote is. Where could it be? But then you just sit in your chair and you look around the room. You're perhaps not going to be as effective as if you get your butt out of the chair and actually get up and move around the room and move stuff out of the way and stuff like that. Probably going to be much better at finding the remote because you're taking an active search approach. So then there are counter adaptations by prey that could also be used in avoiding being found. What could prey do?
Also, probably hearing, smell.
Yeah, so having the ability to detect the presence of a predator. If you can detect a predator before the predator detects you, what can you do?
Run.
Just run away. Just move to a place where the predator is not. And so organisms can space themselves out. They can detect predators before they get there and get out of the way. What's another mechanism that prey can use to avoid being found?
Camouflage.
Oh, things like camouflage, sure. So when you think about adaptations and counter adaptations, think about what are the traits in a predator that would help them in a particular activity, and what are the traits of a prey that would help them get out of becoming prey for something. Dr. Zed, did you have something?
No, I was just enjoying your remote analogy, because we're modeling this stuff in ecology, which you all will do when you take ecology, and we were discussing ambush predators, so I was imagining a room full of remotes where just sitting there and looking is a viable strategy.
Okay. So yeah, so one of the ways of thinking about this is to take it out of the lion on the Serengeti and put it in the context of things that you do on a regular basis. So if search is the first phase, what's the next phase involved in this? What's that?
Catching your prey.
Okay, but before you catch your prey, you have to do something else. So we'll put that in capture down here. But before you can capture prey, what do you have to do?
To find it or identify it.
Okay, so what was the second part of that? Who was that?
Identify it.
Yeah, so you have to recognize your prey. And so if I tell you, if I'm running around and I'm frantic and you're like, hey, what are you doing? I'm like, oh, I'm looking for my keys. I can't find my keys. And you're like, okay, I'll help you look. What's the first thing that you're going to ask?
What do they look like?
What do they look like? Well, if I tell you that they are on a KeySmart Keykeeper, when you find keys that are on a lanyard, you would know what?
Those aren't your keys.
These are not my keys because these are my keys. And so knowing what you're looking for is useful in finding it because you have an image of what it is that you're looking for. And so simply searching doesn't really help you if you don't know what you're looking for. And so recognizing the thing that you're searching for is important. Once you've recognized it, oh, that thing's prey as opposed to something else, you go about the process of capturing it. And then after you have it captured, what do you have to do?
Be able to overpower it.
You have to kill it and eat it. This is usually referred to as handling. And for each of these steps, you can think about what are the predator traits that help them in this process, and what are the prey traits that help them avoid becoming prey. And so here we have searching for prey, recognition of prey, catching prey, and then handling prey. When we think about searching for prey, improved visual acuity, we also talked about hearing and things like this. Having a search image helps you as you search, and searching a limited area where you know that prey hang out. Prey counter adaptations are things like crypsis, looking like something that you're not. Polymorphism, if you're in a species and there are lots of different ways in which your species looks, it's harder for a predator to form a search image because that particular species looks like lots of different things. And then of course they can space themselves out. You guys watch movies much? Does anybody recognize this scene? What is this scene from? Anybody?
It looks familiar, but I can't think of it.
The Shooter.
It is The Shooter, starring Marky Mark Wahlberg. And what you see is Marky Mark is here. I still call him Marky Mark because I don't really care for him as an actor. And I think it's funny that he was Marky Mark in a boy band before he was anything else. So Marky Mark is there, and he's wearing a ghillie suit, and this ghillie suit basically breaks up the outline of the body so that it's harder to see that that's a sniper there rather than just a pile of snow. And that helps you not be noticed, not be found, even though there are other snipers in this environment looking for you to kill you before you kill them. Recognition of prey. You can learn what prey look like. That's part of what a search image is all about. And then, of course, counter adaptations that prey have is that you can just look like other things. Another way in which you can get out of becoming prey is by advertising the fact that you yourself are dangerous or poisonous or toxic. So you can have warning signals. And then you can also mimic other organisms that are toxic or dangerous, such that while you're not toxic or dangerous, the fact that you have evolved mimicry of something that is toxic or dangerous, it prevents the predator from recognizing you as something that is safe to eat, and it views you as something that is not safe to eat. And so aposematism is warning coloration. It's when you are toxic and you have bright coloration, for example. These are all coral snakes that advertise their toxicity, advertise their dangerousness through warning coloration. But then these aposematic coral snakes are also mimicked by milk snakes. So this panel here, which these are all coral snakes, is now this panel here. It's the same two panels, as you can see. And then on the right-hand side of this panel are milk snakes, which are non-venomous mimics of coral snakes. And so two different forms of mimicry. This would all be Mullerian mimicry when dangerous or toxic things mimic one another. And this is Batesian mimicry, where a non-dangerous organism mimics a dangerous organism or a toxic organism. Then with catching prey, this gets to what somebody said, I think it was Dominic who mentioned stealthily sneaking up on prey, having weapons of offense, claws and teeth and things like this. But then predator or prey have different things that they can use to escape the capture phase. They can signal to the predator that it's been detected, which basically says, yeah, I see you. And then that oftentimes will reduce the probability that the predator will escalate the interaction because the predator knows that they've been spotted. Escape flight, having things like sprint speed to rely upon. Startle responses. Have any of you ever killed a rabbit? Dr. Judd, have I ever used this example in this class before?
I don't think so, but there was an animal that was really good at catching rabbits at my last apartment.
So anybody ever killed a rabbit?
Yeah, I accidentally hit one with my car.
But no, killed it with your bare hands.
Oh no.
Bare hands, no. Gun, yes.
Okay, all right, good. Okay, so if you've never killed a rabbit with your bare hands, I worked at a zoo and we had these big pythons, and we would order these full-grown adult rabbits. And an adult domesticated rabbit is a pretty good-sized animal. And the problem with them is in a zoo, when you kill animals to feed to the reptiles, you cervically dislocate them. You basically separate their head from their neck by snapping the neck. And we did that with rats and mice, which was pretty easy, but we also had to do that with the rabbits. And I had never done this with rabbits before, but I was instructed by the lead keeper at the zoo to go and do this. And so I took the rabbits out behind the amphibian and reptile house. There's this fenced in enclosure, and of course nobody can see through it because it's all wood, and then there's the ubiquitous bamboo there. And so I put the rabbit down on the ground. I get the bar behind the neck of the rabbit, and what you're supposed to do is pin the rabbit down and then pull up on their back legs and snap the neck. It's supposed to be a very quick, very easy, painless way of dispatching the rabbit. Little did I know that as soon as I got the rabbit on the ground and it became apparent to the rabbit that it was going to be killed, it lets out this blood-curdling scream. Imagine a woman or a child who is in the process of being murdered. That is the noise that comes out of a rabbit. It startles me. I let go of the rod that is on the back of the neck of the rabbit, and the rabbit takes off. And the zoo director comes out, and he sees me running around the yard. He's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "What does it look like I'm doing?" He's like, "You let the rabbit get away, didn't you?" Startle response. When the rabbit did that, it startled me, and in that split second of me basically losing my mind because this rabbit just screamed at me, that gave that rabbit the split second that it needed to escape. Eventually I caught it, and eventually it got fed to a python. Startle responses. Deflecting an attack with weapons of defense and things like this. So this is stotting behavior. It's a behavior that is seen in certain species of gazelles in Africa. What they do is they bounce around on their 2 feet. They're not bending their legs at all. They're just boing, boing, boing. And they only do this when they're in the presence of a predator and they've detected it. And presumably what this does is it advertises to the predator when they do this stereotyped bouncing motion. It advertises to the predator, "Nanny, nanny, boo-boo, I see you. Don't even try it, because you're so far away from me that if you start to attack me, I'm going to be fast enough that it's not even going to be worth your time." These are some animals that I've caught in my life. There's a box turtle here on the upper left. This is a turtle that has a hinge on the bottom of its shell, such that when it pulls itself into its shell, it can seal itself up to the point that you can't even get a slip of paper in between the bottom shell and the top shell. This is the horned lizard that we've talked about in class. It's a different species of horned lizard than the one that was in the paper, but this is a Texas horned lizard. And once again, you see that it's got all those spines. And we've already talked about how those defend them against shrike attacks. And then once you've been captured, once the reptile keeper has you in his clutches and he's trying to kill you and feed you to a python, if the startle response didn't work, there are still things that you could possibly do. And so on the side of the predator, having the ability to subdue your prey, if your prey is toxic, having the ability to detoxify the defenses of the prey. And then the other thing that rabbits will do is they'll start just kicking the crap out of you if you're trying to kill it. And once again, if it's a nice big adult rabbit, it's not the most pleasant thing in the world to experience being kicked in the side by a rabbit because you're trying to kill it and feed it to a python. In the case of our case study, what we have is we have a newt that has evolved a toxin, and that toxin, at least in some populations of a garter snake, that toxin doesn't have a toxic effect because of an evolutionary response in the predator. And so we're actually going to be talking in this case study about these last two things. This is the newt. This is Tarica granulosa from Benton County, Oregon. What do you notice about this newt? What do you notice about its morphology?
It has a long tail.
It does have a long tail. It's kind of laterally compressed because it swims in the water sometimes, but generally it spends most of its year terrestrially. What else do you notice about it?
It's got a weird looking color to it.
Yeah, so it's kind of brown on top, and it is orangish underneath. What do we know about bright colors in organisms?
Aposematism.
Okay, this might be a form of aposematism. What else do you notice about its morphology, other than it's cute and adorable?
It has like bumpy skin.
Yeah. The common name for this species is the rough-skinned newt. What are those bumps caused by?
Is it
What are
like,
those bumps?
is it the air?
It's not air.
Okay, never mind.
That would be weird if it was air. If it's orange colored, what does it probably have? Especially because I mentioned it a couple of times.
Poison? I don't
What's
know,
that?
maybe.
Connor?
Poison?
It has poison, and those poisons are going to be produced in what?
Maybe in those bumps.
It is produced in those bumps because those bumps are what?
Pores?
So they're glands, and those glands have pores. And so just like you have sweat glands that come out onto your surface of your skin, there are glands in the skin of the rough-skinned newt that produce a toxin. The toxin in this case is a toxin known as tetrodotoxin. Tetrodotoxin is a type of toxin that a wide diversity of different kinds of organisms produce, which basically means that tetrodotoxin production has evolved multiple times. It's found in a variety of different types of amphibians. It's found in a number of marine organisms. In some cases, it is thought to be produced endogenously, which means that it's produced by the organism itself. But in most cases, it's actually produced by a bacterium that has a symbiotic relationship with its host. And so the organism is immune to the toxin produced by the bacterium, but then that bacterially produced tetrodotoxin imparts this anti-predator mechanism to the organism that possesses those bacteria. That orange coloration on the underside of the newt is displayed whenever you come up and poke the newt. It will enter into this behavior, which is called the Unken reflex. And normally when you're looking down at the newt as it's crawling along the forest floor, it's relatively cryptic because it's kind of colored like the forest floor would be colored. But as soon as you walk up to a newt and poke it with a stick or grab it with a pair of forceps or something like this, it does this stereotyped behavior where it reveals that bright underside orange to whatever predator has latched onto it. And once again, it's revealing this coloration because this is presumably an aposematic coloration. And we also think that it's an aposematic coloration because this is a very stereotyped behavior that only happens under certain conditions, usually when you give the newt a little pinch. And frogs that also possess tetrodotoxin or other types of bufotoxins will also do a strategy similar to this, but because their back doesn't bend, they do it just with their hands and their feet. They do the underside. If you've ever seen a fire-bellied toad, it's got either orange and black or red and black modeling on the underside of it that it reveals when when you poke it as well. And so once again, this is a behavioral trait that once again helps the animal when it's being pestered by a potential predator, send a message to the predator, hey, don't eat me, you're going to regret it. So this is the part where we get to the point where the reading that we have for today is going to become important. But Butch Brodie was in Oregon doing his doctoral work, and he was collecting a lot of different kinds of snakes, but he was mainly concentrating on garter snakes. And he was concentrating on one type of garter snake called Thamnophis organoides, but he would occasionally run across Thamnophis tertalis. And because he was interested in predator-prey interactions, he would oftentimes, you can take a snake and you can palp its belly and get it to regurgitate the things that it ate. And so he would do that with all the snakes that he caught to get some information on diet. And what he found was that Thamnophis organoides was a worm and slug eating snake, but he would occasionally find that Thamnophis tertalis was eating newts. And he knew from past information that these newts were in many cases toxic. And so he began to think that maybe these snakes are capable of eating these newts because they have evolved some resistance to the toxin that these newts produce. This is little Butch Brodie the third. This is actually back when he was in graduate school. He's considerably older now. And those are the garter snakes that he's holding up. And you can see in some of the garter snakes, there's a bulge in the gut. And it's because he is collecting gravid females. And you can actually feel the embryos developing. If you pick up a snake and palp your thumb down the length of the snake, you actually feel how many embryos they have inside of them as they develop. And he was using these, this is Thamnophis tertalis from Scott Lake up in the Cascades in Oregon. And what he was doing with these snakes is he was actually looking to see whether or not there was correlational selection for color pattern and behavior. And when we talk about quantitative genetics, we'll revisit this paper here to get across to you this idea that evolution can be acting in different ways on different characteristics. And so you can have selection that acts on one characteristic, you can have selection that acts on a different characteristic, and that selection can be independent of one another, but you can also have selection that acts on suites of traits such that selection acting on one trait also then affects another trait, and that's exactly what was happening in this case. So let's see. We're a little early, but let's just stop there because I think I would rather go through and have a conversation with you about these things. Next time, what we have is the rest of this introduction to get through and then regression. And I think we can probably get that covered on Friday. So what I would like you to do is read the chapter that is now on the Moodle site and come back prepared to discuss the stuff that is in that chapter. Think about, as you're reading that chapter, think about the process of science as it's related in that chapter. He doesn't call a lot of attention to it, but glean what you can about kind of how science operates as you read his description of what has been a long series of papers and a long-term research plan that has taken place over, decades, literally decades worth of research, and how the research has changed over time. And what does that tell you about kind of how scientists do their work? That's also a useful thing to learn from this chapter, as well as the details about the case study that we're going to spend 3 weeks looking into. Questions? Tessa, is this your highlighter? Yes, okay, it's in my office. All right, then we will see you on Friday, and just a couple more days to push through before we all get a break. Hang tight.